Guest is a creative leader based in Toronto who has spent his career building ideas across brands, platforms, and teams. Over the years, he's worked across everything from advertising and digital experience to emerging formats, collaborating with major agencies and global brands along the way. He's also seen the industry from multiple angles, including founding and running his own boutique creative agency before returning to agency leadership. Today, he's a creative director at Cossette, leading creative work for clients like TD and Amazon Prime, Monday Night Hockey, LCBO, and WordPress. So please welcome Stuart Thursby. We're so excited to have you.
Hello, good to be here.
So, Stuart, you started your career as a graphic design intern and eventually moved into roles like art director, creative director, and even founder of your own agency. So when you look back at those early years in Toronto, working inside agencies like Proximity, what were the specific skills or habits you developed back then that still shape how you lead creative teams today?
Great question. I guess the bit of context is I have no formal training in this industry at all. I have a degree in history, and through that didn't want to end up teaching history. And I was always into sports, got into photography, and that led my way in. And I was bound and determined to not go back to school because I'd already started working for a year or so. So I took a couple night courses, but just built my book. I didn't know exactly what angle I wanted it to take. What I liked about advertising art direction as a discipline is that it means more than one thing. It's not just graphic design, it's also concepts, it's also all the various things that we all know go into it. So that kind of range drew me to both the job, because it wasn't as limiting as teaching high school history forever would have been, though I'm sure it would have been rewarding in different ways. But it also meant that when eventually my portfolio was thankfully good enough to get me my first art director job at Proximity, I just dove into it with, I don't know if I'm even supposed to be here, but I'm going to try it and see what happens. At the time, Proximity was quite large. It was a sister digital focus agency of BBDO here in Toronto, so very large historical agency network. So we did a lot of social work, a lot of banner ads, a lot of email, but then within that, we also started doing more television and broadcast and out of home and direct mail and things like that. So I consider myself very fortunate that my first real agency job was both A, large agency, and B, that one, because a lot of the people that I met there are good characters, and they've been some of the people that I've learned from the most, both then and afterwards. And then also B, it exposed me to so many different challenges and opportunities, not in a career sense, but just in terms of type of work. As is maybe already clear, I don't love just doing one thing, because if all you do is websites, the answer is always a better website. If all you do is you need the mix, I think, to be any kind of creative leader, even if you don't have the title. You need to know what a good idea looks like in multiple ways and how it can scale up or scale down, and that applies to what does a brand mean as well as it does to an advertising campaign. So I think the skills, I couldn't tell you one specific one, besides when I found the agency space, and I found an agency that wasn't media specific, but was properly strategic and creative. I just knew I had found my happy place, knowing that the role of an art director, that can mean so many different things. And I don't even mean film and video games or whatnot, but just, my second agency experience was in Berlin, Germany at a 2-person UX design shop. So it's the same skill set, but you're applying it in such a different way. Then I came back to Toronto and worked at a few others. So I think it's just the range drew me, and the skills you develop through that range hopefully lead to better creative work over time that has longer legs. You're able to better tell when a good idea is a good idea, not just a nice kind of one-liner and things like that. And then eventually you learn how to coach others to make their ideas better and things like that. So a bit of a rambly answer, but
no, I love it. We love rambling answers.
It's the mix.
That's so cool. I had no idea you studied history. Like you really never know where life will take you. But I love the perspective that you carried on along the way. So early in your career, you were already working on brands like Starbucks and RBC, Gillette, the Canadian Olympic Committee. So when you're a young creative, suddenly working on brands of that scale, what do you learn about how creativity actually works inside large organizations? Something people outside the industry might not realize.
I'll answer that second part first. When you're watching any kind of a show or a movie and a friend goes like, oh, that's a really good ad. Or how did that terrible ad get made? You always jump to see an actually good piece that makes you go, get made is a miracle, not because anyone is out to see it fail, but because there's so many voices and there's so many perspectives, and you need to the agency is like step 17 in our marketers process. They've done so much before that, their own budgets, their own plans, their own priorities, and all those things. So I think in terms of how it works on the inside, I think it's a miracle when a truly great piece of work gets made, but that's also why we do it, because not every piece can be or has to be that exceptional. Our job is to always make sure that everything we put out is as good as it can be, and sometimes it's worth the 6 months for a brand changing anthemic spot and platform and things like that, and sometimes it's a lot more tactical and action oriented and things like that. So I've now kind of gotten lost in the sauce of that specific answer, but I think it's a case of like getting exposed to not just the tentpole type of work of the really great commercials or at a home or hanging a Mini off the side of a billboard like Taxi did way back in the day to launch the Mini Cooper. Those get you into the business. And when your first brief is a banner and email, you're like, oh, this is kind of part of it as well, because you have a certain number of people you want to click through and like things like that. So it scales up and down, I guess. And I think it's also important to note that I just came in as an art director, but I was young. I was in my early 20s. But there's senior teams, there's ACDs, there's creative directors, there's also account people and strategists. So even if you kind of know all of that in theory, seeing it happen in practice where you have all your rounds of review and all the different voices, you realize how democratic a process it can be and should be. And then over the years, you learn to kind of like hone in on when to hold true to the creative, credit the tie-breaking vote for it, and other times it's kind of other considerations and things like that. So yeah, if you're kind of coming into it as a 23-year-old art director at a small shop, all the same things happen. It's just a different dynamic, and there's no good or bad. It's just where I was, there was a lot of other people I could speak to or get their input on, or how should I tackle X or things like that.
That's very cool. And you have
benefit of 400, 300 to 500 person agency, depending on the count.
And you have managed creative teams across different agencies and projects. So when you're reviewing work from your team, whether it's a campaign concept, a design system, a digital experience, what are the first 2 or 3 things you look at to decide if the idea is strong enough to move forward?
There's always a brief. And if we all think the brief is great, then is the work either to the brief, or if it's off brief, is there an overridingly good reason why? The brief isn't necessarily everything, because sometimes it leads you to an interesting place that you kind of can't predict. But rarely is it about just the pure brilliance of the idea itself. It's always about how is it doing the job against either the challenge that we need to do or what the outline strategy is or things like that. So for your average 80% of the time bog standard project, what I'm looking for is there some kind of emotion to it? Does it make me go, like you need to lean in anyway, whether it's a super saccharine spot or a super funny email, whatever it is, you still need to feel something. But is it also telling the things that we needed to tell, and does it kind of make sense for the brand? That's all standard. More interesting ones are the 20% of the time where it's like, I just had this idea, and it's either about the business as a whole, or it's just a team comes to you with just like, it's not related to any project. They're just like, is there something here? Those are fun, because then it's less about how do we sell it through at all costs. It's more about, God knows we should all have like hobbies and not be thinking about work all the time, and please live your whole life. So that, but sometimes you get an idea when you're doing your own banking or you're doing your own whatever the heck. And I think it's good to pursue those. So what I look for the team in those cases is they just like stress test us against what we know about the business and the client. And there might be something great there, but if it's not right for them, then it doesn't matter. We'll figure something out with it. So I think in terms of what I'm looking for is kind of, again, do the teams, even if they're juniors, have some sense of creative spark, but also some kind of strategic thinking. I don't need them to be strategists, but they're not just jumping for a gotcha. There's an actual thought behind their work. It's appropriate to the channel. You can sometimes play with the format of the channel, but either way, it kind of makes sense in that context. And it ladders up to everything that we're doing. If you're right out of school, my job is to think about 4 of the 5 of those. I just want you to focus on here's a funny one, here's a serious one, here's a whatever the heck. But my senior teams, I'll ask like, so what do you guys actually think? You're just kind of coaching them to more.
That's cool.
Extrapolate what they might already feel, but you're just kind of bringing it out of them, even to be able to prepare it for the client, even though it's maybe felt. It's not always.
Okay. I love that. And you founded Stack Creative and ran it for 4 years, building websites, brand identities, and campaigns for a wide range of organizations, from universities to nonprofits to major brands. I'm curious, what did running your own agency teach you about the business side of creativity?
A little bit of all the other functions, which I think is actually helpful. And I'm sure by this if I'd never started Stack, I'm sure by this stage in my career I would have learned more about resourcing or pricing or scoping or client conversations that are trickier about all that kind of stuff. What I found, it was going well. The only reason why I shut it down is that it was quite small and I didn't have any partners or things like that. And I knew I wanted to be part of a larger context as opposed to king of my own small castle. So the decision to wind it down wasn't motivated by, oh God, we're out of money or out of work. It was just wanted to just focus on the creative again. Because I think in those 4 to 4.5 years, I got into this by teaching myself how to make ads that looked like garbage and got better. And then 10 years later, it was like, okay, learn a little bit about business. I don't need an MBA, but how do agencies position themselves? What kind of work do they sell? How do they package it up? Like it's creative, but it's more strategic versus the actual creative output. And it became a lot easier for us to sell through website work where we're not just doing the design and development, but we're also working on the story. And then after a couple of years, you can start doing the videos and the ad work for it. So all of which is to say that it was kind of I treated it as let's see where this thing goes. It's an experiment where I have contractors and employees and clients I'm responsible for, but it was let's see if there's something there at that stage in my career. But it was mostly a chance for me to kind of broaden my horizons outside of just the creative. As I said at the beginning, if you only do one thing, the answer is always that one thing. And while creative is deeply important to me, and I'd like to thank to our clients as well, because it's how their brand comes across in the marketplace. Knowing what they're thinking about or knowing what goes into properly scoping a project defines to some degree what the answer is going to kind of be. And it shouldn't be one way or the other. So it was a very effective brute force way, I guess, of learning all the other considerations to making work get done and also making an agency grow. That I don't know if I could have quite learned the same diversity or range of things at that exact stage. It would have happened over time. And again, if I'd had a business part, I wouldn't have needed to know half that stuff, but we would have talked about it together. So I think I would listen to a lot of podcasts and read books, but it was less about tech startup books. It was more management books. So the hard thing about hard thing, kind of like all these other things that are more about the difficulties of growing an organization as opposed to, this is also the late 2010s. Tech was everywhere. It was less about trying to build a hyperscaler. It was more about and then combining that with what I already knew about the agency space. So it sounds like it was all over the place. It didn't feel that way. It was kind of every year was so different that you invariably learn from the lessons from the years before. But again, maybe this is anticipating a next question. I don't know. But the only reason to slow it down is that I became pretty good at all those things. But I knew, having been in the room with some exceptional account people, exceptional project managers, exceptional developers and copywriters and strategists, that I knew I wasn't going to out the president of McCann. Like, you're just kind of not there you can't be that level of all of those things. But what I really cared about the most was the creative work and then the people who got it done or got it made. So I really wanted to focus on those two things, which is being a creative director at whatever level it is. So it's been interesting, I guess, kind of like not unlearning, but you kind of let recede into the background the things that aren't as practical, but it makes it way more effective to talk to my other directors at other levels of other functions about what we need to do to get a certain campaign or project made, because I've at a smaller level done parts of all those jobs and I never really want to build a work back schedule directly again, but I can work with those who do so we can make sure that we have the time that we need and respect the overall timelines as one small example. So yeah, it was kind of just a crash course in all the other parts of an agency.
That must have been a very fun and challenging experience, but it sounds like you learned so much from it.
I think so. I don't know if it necessarily made me a better creative director, but I think it made me a more well-rounded advertising, design, and creative worker.
Absolutely.
And I think it's been, again, really affirming, but also fun in the last few years just to focus on creative direction again and just kind of really focus on those parts, because those are the parts that got me into this and that I ultimately loved the most. If I really loved all those things equally, I would still be running a tiny agency, probably under 10, and I'd probably be having a grand time. But I knew I still wanted to be rooted in this world, but just be able to think in other ways.
I love that. And at Array of Stars, you were responsible for building and elevating the creative department while working on experimental, digital, and emerging formats like A&R. So when you're building a creative team almost from the ground up, what are the first things you focus on to create a strong creative culture?
So I won't answer just from the Array of Stars side, because where I'm at with Cossette, it's just a bit of a larger team, and I've had more direct input on some recent hires and things like that. And same with Stack. Array of Stars was a fantastic experience, but also the three partners of the business were still quite involved. It was a boutique-sized shop. They do exceptional work. So there was much around taking what I learned from Stack and just working with the founders and the other co-directors about the direct, other things besides necessarily building it out. Whereas at Stack and Cossette, the actual team itself is a bit larger, at least in terms of who I could directly impact or hire. So, I'll kind of say the same answer I would say to anyone I speak to who I'm not interviewing, but I'm speaking to about getting into the business. It's oftentimes you, the candidate, don't get a job, and it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the rest of the context. Because of, speaking generally, it's as much about, can I say this whole answer again?
Mhm.
Can you ask it again and we just restart?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, at Array of Stars, you were responsible for building and elevating the creative department while working on experiential, digital, and emerging formats like A&R. So, when you're building a creative team almost from the ground up, what are the first things you focus on to create a strong creative culture?
Fair. So, the main experience where I built the team from the ground up was actually Stack, because Array of Stars, there was already the partners and the other directors and some team members there. And Cossette, I've been hiring for my teams and things like that, but there's also a wider infrastructure there. So Stack was the only place where I got to kind of do it from scratch. So the main thing and you start with contractors because it takes a while to have enough recurring revenue to be able to afford a second salary, regardless of what the levels are and things like that. So the level 1 version of that is you start off by hiring contract people who you don't need to worry about, who are going to do a great job of what they're looking for. And that worked for developers and writers and UX designers. As we built our team out, or as Stack got built out, it was more around how does the mix come together. Again, unique in the sense that I was the creative director, but also founder. There wasn't necessarily an account lead. But my full-time art director, her focus shifted, but what I saw in her was a real hunger and desire to learn the channels we were working in, but she could bring a different perspective than mine. So that, plus not needing to worry about every single hour, because I know she had it covered, and she worked incredibly well with all the other contractors I had, made it not just, someone who I could trust for one project, but I kind of trusted to not carry my vision forward, but just be the senior designer and art director for the shop. And that kind of applied for, the project managers that we kind of brought in and things like that. So where it gets interesting is when you pair contrasts, and you have to be a little bit careful with that. But I think you don't need to be so precious about it because we're all, for the most part, well-meaning humans who want to do good work together. And I think it's really interesting when you pair someone who's a super seasoned senior with maybe more of an intermediate full-timer for a couple projects, or in the case of people who shall remain nameless kind of a thing, but just, someone who's a bit quieter, someone who's a bit more out there, or two people who are out there. And I think you're not trying to play marionette with people's lives. It's not that per se, but I've tried to hone my sense of, the people that we bring on full time, certainly at Cossette, is what can they add and bring to the team and the culture we're developing here that is both their own specialness, but also is an addition to what we already have that we like and that we already have as a part of. And I think that goes back, a decade to when I kind of first started managing people, where it's not just about how good they are, it's also how do they fit. And I'm a very large proponent that we should not all be singing from the same songbook, but we do make sure that you got to have a higher bar for like character and follow through and taste, but I want as wide a range of personalities as kind of fit within that, as long as people have high character and things like that. So, I want my team to come to me if they're frustrated. I want my team to come to me if they're excited, or not come to me and go to someone else because they're excited as well. Like, you kind of want them to just be them, because I want me to just be me as well. And that's the kind of culture that we're going for here. So it's many elements to it, of course, but in terms of building from scratch, it's in some ways easier than building not from scratch. But I think even if you enter a fully baked in team, it takes a few months to know what everyone's not just strengths and weaknesses are, but what dynamics are at play. And then you kind of assess how many of these are ones that we're thrilled with, how many of these want to change, and change shouldn't require people change as the first 7 courses of action, and kind of start with what can we change dynamically and energy-wise and things like that.
Very cool. Sounds like you have a very cool culture to work with.
I think so. So I think the people I work with think so as well. We got a pretty good crew going here. So.
It sounds very, very, very cool and diverse. Love it. I love that perspective that you're bringing to your team.
For sure.
And as a creative director, you're reviewing ideas from different designers and writers and strategists. For you, what usually separates a good idea from the one that makes you say, this is the one we should fight for?
The glib answer is you just know it when you see it.
The intuition? Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that's, again, there's, before I'm even seeing a brief, it's been in strategy for a month, and maybe they're brought in to kind of help stress test some things, but usually it's their domain. So it kind of starts with, if we're getting a brief and I feel like the strategists or the account leads either rushed it or the client's kind of forcing it down a direction that we don't necessarily agree with, or sometimes it's just messy and wordy.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of words and a lot of mess is a sign that something in there might be right, but we don't quite know what, or we're just copying and pasting or something like that. So I don't think every brief can reasonably have a once a decade insight baked into it. But there's no reason why you can't make sure that the agency brief that we get to shape through our strategy chops is as sharp and pointed and has a perspective as can be. And then I look for the work to have a perspective as well. And if it's the strategist perspective, just said creatively, fantastic. If they come up with a different perspective, but it's still true to the business, let's kind of talk about that. So I think there's a lot of, not in a bad way, but like, so many ads out there.
Oh my God, yeah.
Meta world's a big world and all these things. Like at a certain point, awareness and impact, and just there's a rule, not in terms of mass being television, but just in terms of getting a lot of eyeballs. Like that does part of the job. But our job on top of that is to make it not just wallpaper and noise, but true, some level of meaningful, some level of engaging, and some level of interesting to somebody. So it's less about, is that a great headline? It's more like, is that a great headline that's right for all those kind of various factors? So I look to the brief to make sure that if I have 6 words on a slide, I'm like, yep, that's what it's about. It makes the whole process easier. If there's 20 slides and the summary is tactical executions, then you can't always rescue that in creative. So what I look for in the brief, as well as in the team's work, is the same kind of thing of, do you know what you're talking about here? Do you believe in where you're going? And that's 90% of the thing. And then what's actually the right way of going about it is where we work together on it.
And you have worked with major brands across very different industries. So when you start thinking about a new campaign, how do you find the balance between protecting the brand and still doing something creatively bold?
I think that's, every piece of work should balance that. Because I think if you're
Absolutely.
just protecting the brand, like a brand guideline is only so large, and there's a lot of other things that a brand does besides what's in the brand guideline. And a brand guideline is an incredibly important document, but the more it's, you kind of oriented around the North Stars of the meaning as opposed to the specific executional examples, it still gives you range. You can come up with something that the brand agency could have never conceived of, but as long as it's hitting the points of what the brand needs to express in a way that meets the campaign objectives and is still doing its job. I don't think everything needs to be completely different for the sake of it. There's no for the sake of it is like anathema to me kind of a thing. Like I think it's got to be, it can be a slapstick of a campaign, but it still has to be a thoughtful slapstick, not in terms of it being necessarily deep and literary, but in terms of there's a reason why, that made sense for it and things like that. So ultimately, it is a balance, but every campaign is, the website's a balance, like a van wrap is a balance. And I think it's kind of, you shouldn't be so stuck to the brand that you can't explore, but you can't be so stuck on the campaign objective so you forget who you're advertising for. And I think that's the balance that whether it's a single email or a 360 campaign, needs to strike.
Well, that was a brilliant response. And you've said that the best creative work isn't just a one-off campaign, but an idea with legs, something that can evolve and live for a long time, which I find very cool. Can you walk us through how you recognize when an idea has that kind of long-term potential?
Yeah, I think most work doesn't have that as the goal, and I think that's okay, because you only need to recreate your brand foundation every so often. If you're changing your brand meaning every 3 years, then that's a sign of a bigger business problem as opposed to anything else. So I think there is a time and a place for a one-off, whether it's a super topical thing or it's just, is that email tab there? A super topical thing, or just something that is such a precise media opportunity for a certain, we'll always have the time for that. But I think it's the sign of a good idea is like, could it work in other contexts pretty strongly or the same strongly or things like that. So you don't need to always have it run in 50 places, 50 different placements and channels to know if it could. I think you can tell pretty quickly where this is just meant to be this specific billboard in Times Square, but also the campaign should probably be more than that. So therefore, is it all about specific placements and other, you can kind of riff till the cows come home. No, I think that's more like ideas that have legs is just kind of, again, a sign of a little bit more of that deeper and more strategic thinking. Yeah.
Okay, I love it. I love it. And in your current role at Cossette, you collaborate closely with strategy, accounts, tech, production. So, from your perspective, what does good collaboration between those disciplines actually look like when a campaign is coming together?
We're all humans, so the day-to-day experience at any office environment should ultimately be, at the very least, net neutral, ideally net positive in some way. And I think with part of that also requires candor and directness. You can't just, it's not summer camp. We're ultimately here to work, but it's neither a dictatorship nor is it summer camp. Like it has to be, I want to hear from my strategists. I want to hear from my producers. I want to hear from my, all the other, my account lead especially. Even today we were an internal for a campaign. So like the first couple reviews were from the ECD and the couple strategists. And then as we were leaving, we'd heard from their account lead all through the meeting. And as we were leaving, I just said to her, I was like, so what do you really think? So I knew that we all like the work, but what do you really think to an account director is very different than what do you really think to a strategy director? And I think or a creative director for that matter. So I think I don't try and do all of their jobs and I don't try and solve for all of them. But if ultimately an agency exists to make creative work, then the responsibility that I have for the accounts that I lead is to make sure that the creative work we're putting out is the best that it can be. And you don't get there by browbeating everybody into like the idea that I had or, the idea of the week, but making sure that you're really pointedly and clearly talking about the pros and cons of whatever you need to talk about in a way where everyone feels safe to do that in the room. And then you can giggle a little bit afterwards and get on with your day. So I think it's ultimately the safe space. It's not, you hear like it's a family here that can be okay, but gets pretty toxic pretty quickly. So I don't think it's about having any kind of facade like that. It's just, whoever my account director hired to be an account soup, I trust their judgment. So let's just work with them and then kind of go from there. There should, all voices should be heard. And sometimes other voices matter more in that particular conversation.
Absolutely.
Whether it's budget, whether it's timing, whether it's a creative idea or things like that. And for the most part, I've been lucky to work in pretty collaborative environments or helped add on to positive collaborative environments. Have avoided overly negative ones, thankfully.
Very cool. And you are currently working with brands like TD and Amazon Prime's Monday Night Hockey. So when you're developing work for big brands today, do you think there is something that clients are asking for now that they weren't that they weren't asking for even 5 or 10 years ago?
Probably many things. Were you working in this industry 10 years ago?
No.
That's okay. So much of it was like, because 15 years ago it was like, make your Facebook fan page, have it like it's, all of human history is ultimately some level of progress and change, and that's okay. So many of the questions are different, but I'll use TD as a specific example because, so the work that Cossette does for TD, it's all in the one-to-one channel. So it's rooted in CRM and email marketing, expands a bit beyond that, but either way, you're speaking to specific customers who already exist for the bank. There's an awareness aspect to it in terms of, upcoming offers or your mortgage is up for renewal and like things like that. But ultimately, we know who the audience is because they're already customers of TD. And once you know what subsegment of their customer base we're talking to for an action-oriented campaign, whether it's email or also includes banners and things like that, then the questions that you're talking about are probably not that much different than they were 15 years ago. How you get there has changed in terms of, the technology's evolved in some way. And again, like better at segmenting and more tailored offers and all that kind of good stuff. So it's a very different type of conversation versus if we were rebranding TD or like something like that. So yeah, so I think all of it's changed, but none of it's really changed because if you're still not really believing in the work that you're making, then the actual channel is secondary and the channel is also very important. But if you're just following the shiny object, you're never going to fully just chasing the damn car the whole day. If you're a dog, 17 metaphors at once there. So I think it's even within the context of like a 3 email campaign for a very specific audience, you're still asking, what else have they been told? Is this offer a great one or a medium one? How can we kind of ultimately, hit the jobs of the campaign while also making somebody want to actually click through? And you do that by being creative and true.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that perspective.
The media can change. The channel can change. AI, irrelevant to this discussion. It's, is it creative and is it true? Matters.
Absolutely. I love that.
That's the game.
That's the game. And you have also said that the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning is that spark of an idea that can grow into something bigger. And I'm curious,
Mhm.
after all the roles you've held, founder, freelancer, creative director, what still excites you the most about the creative industry right now?
It's going through a lot of changes, not just the AI side of things, but certainly, holding companies and mergers and acquisitions and things. So it's a different atmosphere than it was 15 years ago, which in turn was different than it was 15 years before that and 15 years before that. So I think what still keeps me going is that why I wanted to do this specifically versus video games or film, or turns out sports photography would have been a completely legitimate way to make. There's a lot of sports out there, but it felt, as much as I loved that combination, a bit too. Didn't want to spend my life living in a car driving between sporting events, So what gets me out of bed and brings me here is that everyone who I'm working with and have worked with over my career, for the most part, excuse me, likes the fact that this is a type of work where it isn't just one thing. We're not just creating worlds in video games. You can play with radio for one session in the morning, and then the afternoon you're doing direct mail, and the next day you're coming up with a platform idea. And I think that range and diversity of creative thinking is a huge appeal that brought me into it. And then again, the duty that we owe is how do you kind of see it through and make sure it's the right thing to do. And that, in terms of both working with our team members is also collaborating with the client, is also a hugely appealing thing. And I can't think, maybe a film set's great. I do not know those other worlds, but this world that I have chosen, I greatly enjoy the mix of it. Even though the tactics have changed, the scale has changed, the pace has changed, the fundamentals have only changed very little, if at all. And I think that's the fundamentals that were brought me into it, not the fact that Facebook was new or something like that. So.
I think you have a very grounded perspective. And it seems like you have worked with some really cool people. So before we wrap up, we love giving guests the chance to recognize the people who helped shape their journey. So looking back at your career, I mean, is there one, two, three people who had a real impact on your growth, mentors, collaborators, or leaders who helped push you forward?
Many, but not everyone. And I don't mean that as a dig in anybody at all. Besides, I've been very fortunate, as I said a little bit ago, to mostly work in pretty positive environments. And I've learned any creative director or ECD or CCO that I had, I've learned something from all of them. And it's pretty much all been positive. You hear other stories that aren't necessarily that. And I kind of was thankful to avoid it. So I think once you add names but my first couple weeks of proximity, so I was hired by the two Johns of Gagne and Weber, and then my first projects were with Danny Gaeta, Trent Thompson, and then Rene Rouleau. And then I'm still working with Trent today. I was working with Danny last year. I think it's not about collecting friendships, it's that you end up doing your own thing for a decade, then you kind of come back together again. And I think I greatly, on a personal level, it's a lot of fun. But what I learned from those names specifically was, again, it was your first agency. You learn so much at your first shop, the way that you learn so much from the household that you grow up in, good or bad or anything in between. And what was really fortunate about them is that certainly, again, Danny and Trent, I was working with the most day to day, as well as John Weber. So the three of them, it was kind of like high standards and kindness. I'm like, great, that can coexist. And then you just kind of carried that forward for the next 15 years. Working with Ian McKenzie at FCB6, it was an interesting time because he was just helping shape a renewal of that agency with Andrea Cook and other people like that. So it was a very everything's kind of changing an exciting time, but I've known him for a while, but I hadn't worked with him before. But his just level of standard of what a good idea needs to include, and his phrase of shoot bullets at it, I picked it up a decade ago and I keep it to this day because you got to keep poking at an idea to make sure that it's good. So, I'm once again getting lost in the sauce of the answer because I didn't have a Rolodex prepared of names, but I think it's less about, I never had one mentor who I looked up to for everything. It was, how do I kind of balance all of these various different things and ultimately be the type of leader that I want to see, which is ultimately, knock on wood, hoping for high standards and kindness, or at least pleasant to work with. Because I call it teacher mode, where I'm just I'm not sure if the brief is right about this. I do, you can tell when my focus is a little bit more sure. But for the most part, the type of environments that I'm trying to build, there's puns, there's wordplay. We kind of ask how your weekend is in one GIF. GIFs are old, I know, we're all millennials, but ultimately it's just about how do we bring not our full true selves, because that's disingenuous, but at least, the bulk of who we are to the job every day and make it a place that people enjoy working in. So therefore, we're just focused on the work. as opposed to all the other kinds of things. And the people that I've worked under or worked with, I've been very fortunate, were the ones who, those are the conditions they were setting.
That sounds amazing. Very cool. Very, very cool. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. It was really great talking with you. I love the perspective you bring to creativity and leadership and building ideas that last. It was a very fun conversation. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in.
You've been listening to Fully Managed, brought to you by Penji. Check out the show notes to learn more about today's guest, and to learn more about Penji, the human-first creative subscription service, head over to penji.co. And by the way, if you're still listening, it would mean the absolute world to us if you were to share this podcast with a friend and, of course, subscribe.